name is Josh White, and this is Globalist, a current affairs podcast from the battleground. At the end of July, the North African Spanish territory of Ceuta was the focus of a sudden wave of tens of thousands of migrants crossing over by sea from Morocco. Over 100 people drowned in the attempt to get around the Spanish border fence by sea. And yet these events have been sucked into an international media furore. There were immediate questions about how this wave of people suddenly came into Ceuta, but the scenes were also seized upon by the global anti-migrant right, as we might call it. The sight of migrants swimming to a European territory, albeit on the African continent, was soon reframed as some kind of invasion of Europe itself. And the Spanish government immediately faced opportunistic attacks from within and without, whether it be from critics and rival parties, using the incident for propaganda ends. And soon, the Italian government suspended the Schengen free movement arrangement with Spain for the month of August, as if there was a land border between the two nations. And now Spain has retaliated against Italy. So it's important to ask what prompted the sudden human wave into Ceuta, and what role did Morocco's allies play in this tragic event? Joining me to discuss this story is my co-host, Mitchell Plitnick.
Hey, Josh. So I think there's a couple of things that we need to look at with this. First, I mean, the framing of this as a migrant invasion of Europe is absurd and just part of I think what you accurately described as an anti-migrant hysteria that's global. And of course, it was pounced on by so many in Europe and so many here in the United States, as well as evidence of Spain's being quote unquote soft on migration. Um, but I think there was on the other side a framing of this that was also inaccurate as a sort of anti-colonial movement, as a move against Spain's colonizing of both Ceuta and the other North African enclave that it controls, Melilla. Um, and that's not accurate either. I mean, in the sense that these are Spanish colonies, that's technically true. But any anti-colonial movement has to start with the people being colonized, not anybody else. That's how you know that's kind of fundamental to any sort of anti-colonialist thinking, and that's not what happened here. Um, there was a number of factors, and I think I think it was hard for a lot of people to know how to react immediately because most people, I think, don't really think a lot about Ceuta. Certainly not in the United States, and I don't think in Europe much either, despite the fact that what we have is a pretty unusual situation where these are just two North African enclaves essentially that are still under European control. It's the only two that are still under. They're not the only two colonies, but they are just the only two under European control, and I think that produces kind of a knee-jerk response in a lot of ways. It produces a response both among the left, who can frame it in an anti-colonial framework, which I think is mistaken, but also on the right, which frames it as an African invasion of Europe, which is just this horribly scary thing. Oh, the black and brown skinned people are coming to get us white people. It's a pretty classic formulation, and I think that's what we saw here, and it ignored the broader political realities, which is that Spain and Morocco have basically been diplomatically at each other's throats for decades. This is not new. There is a lot of tension between these two countries. They have broken off formal relations with each other. And this is not the first time that Morocco has helped to engineer a large movement of people into Ceuta and Melilla. Um, they did it in 2021 as well because Spain allowed the the ostensible president of Western Sahara, of the Sahrawi people, into Spain for medical treatment. And they did it this time because Spain was working to warm relations with Morocco's rival Algeria, which is its own story, but and more than we can go into here, but was almost totally ignored by all people. You know, the entire spectrum in the West. The fact that this was really about Spain's relationship with Algeria and how that angered Morocco. That that uh, that just got missed by everybody. Partially, I think, because Algeria as a country is just one that isn't on a lot of people's radar. Um, Morocco is only on people's radar because of its own recent changes in terms of its place in uh, American politics and its increasingly warm relations with Israel, which of course was another piece of this that I think got badly distorted because immediately when this happened, of course, as we might expect, um, Israel jumped on it as look how messed up Spain is. Look how Spain lectures Israel about this and that, and look how they treat migrants coming over their borders. And at the same time, the United States used it as a way to attack the socialist president of Spain, uh, very much in line with the campaign rhetoric that's going on here now against the progressive elements in the Democratic Party, which they're calling not just calling socialist but communist, which is completely insane. So we have all of these different sort of political agendas at work, and what this really was Morocco cynically using people, its own people, um, to hurt Spain. Um, these were not these were not stateless migrants, as we see, so tragically, so often, people fleeing countries with what they can carry. These people weren't carrying anything because that's not what was happening here. Morocco was actually preying upon people who were looking for a better future, who are maybe struggling to find work, struggling to make ends meet, thinking that Europe would be a better option, and through a combination of misunderstanding of some of the things that happened in Spain's courts and some of its political decisions as well as its legal ones, and intentional deception on the part of the Moroccan government that helped drive people into Ceuta. You had all of these people sort of flooding in into that enclave, and through all of the political agenda, I think we've again missed the fact that this is a large number of people that are being cynically used and put at risk. In fact, some of them were killed. I think over 100 were killed, um, somewhere around that number, trying to get to Ceuta, just because of a political dispute between Morocco and Spain, one which was certainly egged on but did not originate with the United States and Israel. So it's a very, very ugly situation, and one that few people have, I think, contributed to positively.
I certainly agree that there's been very few positive contributions, um, especially when it comes to kind of European politics. If you look at the British perspective on this, it was very much framed by right-wing outfits as this invasion, and it was talked up as if people were streaming over the Spanish border directly into Europe, which was again completely absurd when you look at the map. This is also partly what fueled a certain kind of leftist reaction to say that, well, this is actually just Moroccans returning to another part of Morocco and so on. And actually, that is also somewhat simplistic, to say the least, as you've said, even though it is a territory on the continent of Africa, of course. But also looking at the wider European response, the Commission has kind of failed to take a strong line on this that kind of coheres against certain other forces within the European Union. The most obvious being the Meloni government of Italy, which has leaped on this completely cynically in a move against Spain. And again, Spain is being singled out here by right wingers because it has a left wing government, whereas Italy, which has a much bigger kind of influx of migrants right now, at least, I think anyway, isn't being held up as somehow as some kind of what would be the say what would be the phrase weak link in Europe that is allowing this kind of thing to go on. And there's also another strange irony in this is that some right wingers are also actually quite enamored with the Spanish police response and security response to the migrants because it has been pretty brutal. And most of the people who've got into Ceuta have been now expelled, sent home. And again, that was always going to be the case, but it was a spectacle. And that spectacle has delivered a certain kind of message, particularly about the politics of Spain, that somehow the Sanchez government is far too liberal on immigration and far too tolerant of this kind of thing. The kernel of truth in that is that Sanchez has tried to implement some degree of reform for an opening to to irregular migrants, what are commonly called illegal immigrants, but are actually irregular migrants, because there is a pragmatic case for saying, hang on, you've got these people living in your country, working in most cases, and trying to live a decent life. You might as well formalize their status to allow them that decent life and allow them to contribute to the country properly. And yet that is kind of ruled out by the kind of anti-migrant politics that is increasingly dominant in Europe, unfortunately. And if you look into the history of this, there's a kind of paradox here that is, again, never talked about in the popular press, which is the migration paradox, which is how securitarian border policies have actually increased immigration in many cases and actually hastened demographic change. And Morocco and Spain are a key example of this. Morocco and Spain had visa-free travel arrangements until 1991. The the result of this was largely circular migration flows. People would come and go, do a bit of work here and there, and it was largely fine. Of course, there were problems, there always are. But for the right wing critics who claim that, oh, yes, there's been this liberal immigration experiment, or even the more radical elements will say it's the great replacement, it's a deliberate plot against the white race and all that hysterical nonsense. Well, the Moroccan population of Spain was something like 50,000 in 1991. I mean, in terms of like an irregular presence, right? And now it's probably over 1 million people. Um, so that's probably including regular and irregular. But you get my point. That is the result of introducing visa restrictions and much more tough and stringent immigration policies. That's the paradox that plays out here. And the Ceuta crisis is a part of that. But this is also, again, a global phenomenon. You have only to look at the southern border of the United States to see that this isn't unique to Spain.
Yeah, it's disturbing, I think, on a global level, because what we're what we're confronted with in the United States is the same thing I think Europe is confronted with, uh, in terms of migrants coming in. These, the entire issue of migration is driven by a legacy of colonialism, and then that led into a era of neoliberalism, all of which created enormous poverty in the global South. Uh, and rather than address that, rather than say, well, maybe we owe some compensation to people who can no longer make a living, to people whose environment we destroyed, to people whose economies we dominated, and whose resources we robbed. Rather than saying maybe we should make amends for that, we demonize the migrants and close our borders, um, and and end up in this major struggle, which brings us now into a condition where migration is a permanent fact of life, whether legal or irregular, or however we classify different groups of migrants, um, and we try to find various regulations to get around the basic bottom line, which is that we need to compensate people for the resources we've stolen. If we do that, there will not be so much migration, and what migration there is will be very easy to handle, and in fact, probably welcome. Um, whether in the West or the global South, it would be nice if if we could repair these countries to the extent that that people would want to migrate there, as opposed to emigrate out of there. But this is of a piece with what we're seeing here in here in the United States with the crackdown on immigration. I mean, we just took away temporary protective status from numerous nationalities, which means they are open and at high risk of deportation, particularly egregious in the case of Haiti, where we have many Haitians who came here seeking asylum, thanks to just centuries of interference, first by France and then by the United States, that have crippled Haiti in so many different ways and have made it a terribly dangerous place to live. And people come here because they will literally be killed in Haiti, and now we're going to send them back. Um, and the fact, I think, this kind of brings me back to what happened here in Ceuta and how it was something that was uh, traced in some circles back, as it so often is the case, to Israel. Um, this was not an Israeli operation, despite what some people think. It's kind of stunning how everything is somehow can be an Israeli operation. Not every ill in the world is caused by Israel, which is not to say that Israel had nothing to do with this. Israel and its supporters had made the case that Morocco should do something exactly like this. The American Enterprise Institute published a paper by Michael Rubin earlier this year, I think it was back in March, where essentially Rubin said this is exactly what Morocco should do: start herding, um, you know, down on their luck people into Ceuta. Specifically naming the Ceuta and Melilla as the destinations because they're right there in Africa. Um, when not long after that, the Israeli daily Ynet published an opinion piece calling for the same thing. So many people see this as Israel having problems, but this was clearly a Moroccan action, and it was the very reason that these things were published was because the authors knew Morocco was already considering doing something like this. They knew of the tension between Morocco and Spain was growing over Algeria and over Spain's stance on the Western Sahara, which is always a key factor in almost everything that has to do with Morocco's foreign policy, one way or the other. Again, Israel and the United States being the only two countries um, until very recently, when Colombia joined them, um, to recognize Morocco's sovereignty over the Western Sahara. Um, so uh, the the confluence of the global right and the confluence of American and Israeli interests with Morocco are there. But this was, we should not be robbing Morocco of its agency. We shouldn't any more than we should be ignoring the fact that the people that Morocco used to carry this out, the Moroccans themselves, in many cases, some cases they were not, they were themselves migrants to Morocco. Um, we're all being cynically manipulated, and Morocco uh, is the focal point. It was Morocco that decided to do this. This is something, again, as I mentioned earlier, Morocco did a few years back. It does not need Israeli or American prodding or much less pressure to do something like this. It has its own reasons for doing it. Um, but that doesn't mean that it didn't serve American and Israeli interests, that those countries did not applaud it, and that those countries might not have, even leading up to it, say, yeah, this might be a good idea to do this. use people in this manner. Get a few people killed. It'll make Spain look bad. Um, it is a pretty sad commentary, but it's not a surprise. And again, it speaks back to the point I made earlier about how Ceuta and Melilla are not uh, are colonies, but this is not an anti-colonial issue. The push to remove Spain, or to there is a push uh, to get Spain out of Ceuta. That push is not coming from the people in Ceuta. That push is coming from Morocco, which wants to take Ceuta into its own sovereignty, as it has Western Sahara. This is exactly what they did 50 years ago. When Spain was leaving Western Sahara, Spain essentially passed on the colonial dominance to both Morocco and Mauritania. Mauritania found it unsustainable, so they left, and Morocco took the rest. And it's been under occupation ever since. And I think we can talk about how this incident plays into the struggle for liberation in Western Sahara. But I think it's really key for us to keep in mind that this is, the anti-colonial language that comes into play around Ceuta is not organic. It's coming from Morocco, which is itself a colonial country.
Yes, and the real anti-colonial case here is about Western Sahara, and that's it. There is, of course, a historical irony and unfortunate, tragic story here. In the Morocco, once a colonial subject itself, becomes a colonizing force, and many people who aren't aware of this history will be asking, well, hang on, why is this Arab country aligned with Israel over certain issues? Well, the answer to that question is the Sahrawi people, who are subject to colonial rule, in the last full sense on Africa, on the African continent. And they're unfortunately been completely marginalized from international political discourse, even more so than they were historically. And it's worth listening to the rebel organization, or the National Independence Organization, I should say, the Polisario Front, when it comes to this crisis, because they have been very clear in their line on what has happened. They have explicitly said that Morocco is using migrants as a weapon for political blackmail and regional destabilization. And it's always worth listening to the official groups of the oppressed in these cases. Um, and as you said, this is almost a repeat, although I think it's bigger than what they did in 2021. Because I think this was it was 50,000 initially, but it's probably around 80,000 in total people that came over the border. And that's a kind of inevitable trigger for conspiracy theories in cases like this. I don't remember there being such a dramatic surge of conspiracism over it in 2021, but in this case, it's very it's powerful. It's hard to even go on social media without seeing stuff about this that's conspiratorial. Um, but the fact that conspiracy theories are making a certain structural claim about certain events doesn't mean that there isn't kind of a kernel of truth, insofar as that there are certain state actors that are trying to benefit or exploit a situation. And that's a very different claim from the idea that there is some sort of cabal or hand directing events. Um, Unfortunately, it's very difficult to disentangle these things for some people.
What's changed, and what's changed kind of dramatically, is that uh, while Morocco has always had sort of a fairly a pretty close relationship with Israel, it was clandestine for a very long time. It got more out in the open in recent years, but then when Morocco joined the Abraham Accords, I think a lot changed. That was, of course, when the United States recognized Moroccan sovereignty over Western Sahara, and I think that that brought a lot of that sort of parallelism between the Moroccan occupation of Western Sahara, the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, as well as the Golan Heights, but that is a slightly different category because of the the fact that there's another country, Syria, being involved with that. Um, that brought that comparison much more together, right, and much more visible. And we're seeing it now. We're seeing in Congress just recently. There is a bill that I reported on that was seeking to support the Moroccan claim to Western Sahara and to make the Polisario Front label them a terrorist group, which is kind of incredible considering the Polisario Front has been around pretty much since Spain left Western Sahara, and has been a a relative. I mean, they have certainly used armed resistance from time to time, but it hasn't been the main feature of what they've done. Um, but now they are, going to be labeled a terrorist group because legitimizing them in any way risks legitimizing Palestinian resistance as well. So that those things are coming together, and again, that feeds into why I think people don't look at Morocco as an independent actor. That and the fact that Morocco is a former colonial entity, colonized entity that is now a colonizing entity. Although one could kind of say the same about the United States, really. Um, but but that that parallel has become, I think, more crucial for propaganda purposes, um, and um, it helps. I think it's going to help bring Morocco much more, shall we say, into the inner circle with the United States and Israel in terms of strategizing in North Africa, an area that Israel in particular has some real interest in. Partially because it's the Maghreb area is filled with Arab countries, partially because Egypt is also concerned with these issues. Um, there's a whole there's also interest in Libya that's not far away, um, but the wild card there will continue to be, I think, Morocco's tense relationship with Algeria, because that's where, from Morocco's point of view, that's where they have the real clash, right? And again, I don't want to get into that relationship because that's its own show. It's a bit complicated. It has a long history, but that's part of where their sensitivity towards Western Sahara comes from, because of course Algeria, for obvious reasons, supports the Sahrawi. So uh, this this kind of tangled web of interests comes together in various times, and I think it's a comment a bit on the way the entire world, the left and the right, look at um, places like North Africa, which are not in the news every day. They're not, we don't focus on them. We don't have the same reports on the news, whether it's the BBC or the New York Times or whoever, on North Africa that we do about Iran, about Israel and Palestine, about Russia, about Ukraine. Um, and people, I think, kind of jump on these things without necessarily looking at to see what might be there, what strands might be there that are not in the immediate narrative that comes out of an incident like this sudden migration wave into Ceuta. Um, it's I think really crucial to recognize that Morocco is a player here. People are thinking about this in terms of a migrant crisis. People are thinking about this in terms of Spain. They're thinking about it in terms of Israel and the United States. And Morocco seems somehow down the list, and it should not be. Uh, again, this is a country that is occupying a neighbor in the Western Sahara in a very similar way on many levels to the way Israel occupies the West Bank. I would, and Gaza to some extent, but I think the West Bank is a closer comparison. Um, But in either case, it's very ugly. But we don't talk about it. We don't think about it, even though it is an American. Morocco is an American ally, and Europe, and in many ways a European ally as well. Uh, Not for Spain, but for other European countries. And the other side of it is what you've discussed at length, which is how this is just being seized on as another anti-migrant talking point. And I do keep coming back to this, but I think it's really important to keep reminding ourselves that we're talking about people being used in a really, really ugly way here.
100%. And again, it's important to stress that there is a history here, and that we've been here before in many different ways. We Many people forget that this isn't the first time this has happened, nor is it just the case that Morocco has played this game. If you look at Libya under Colonel Gaddafi, he used migration as a negotiating tool, particularly with Italy, and extracted billions of euros from the Italian government on that basis, which he then dressed up domestically as reparations for colonial crimes, which they were not reparations. Um, so it's definitely the case that we've been here before, not just with Morocco. And Europeans need to grapple with this. And failure of European institutions, particularly the European Commission, to orchestrate some kind of effective, humane response to the migrant crisis, as it's often called, is really telling. There's not really a push against, or not much of a pushback against Meloni, which is going to be effective in this case, because so much of European politics is being shifted to the right on immigration, and the Spanish government is very much beleaguered in this. And even other progressive governments, seemingly progressive governments in Europe, including outside of the European Union, such as Britain, are not progressive when it comes to immigration anymore. And that is a big part of this picture. It's not just that there's a global anti-migrant right on the march, which is obviously driving this stuff, but there is a failure on the centre left and a failure of institutions to actually counter that.
Yeah, there's also, I think, um, the use of the Schengen agreement, the free travel agreement in Europe, as a stick here by Italy. Um, this is. Uh, I just, it's hard to describe how cynical I find this, because these sort of strict border controls that we're dealing with, Europe has kind of one of the, there's so much about the European Union that has been dysfunctional. But the idea that Europeans can go from one country to another with relative ease is not part of that dysfunction. It is part of a function. It is part of something positive, and should be something that's built on, not used as a political cudgel. But political cudgels are what we're widely dealing with, and it to me it's sort of ironic, because clearly, Maloney is trying to create a narrative here that Italy must protect itself from Spain's open border policy, and this sort of nonsensical thinking. Um, it's also a way, and I don't think Maloney is going to say this outright, but it's also a way of simply trying to humiliate Pedro Sanchez, much like what Trump is doing. The You will not be a socialist in the West is what I think we're seeing from Maloney, as we are seeing it as well from Trump. Um, and all of this is of a piece. It's all, these sort of the military, the idea of a militarized border, the idea of you know the xenophobic attitude towards migration, the idea that migrants are to blame for all the problems. And look, we should admit this is not just a European or an American phenomenon. We're seeing some very, very ugly anti-migrant xenophobia right now in South Africa in particular. It is something that is kind of an I don't want to say a natural outgrowth, but it's a common outgrowth of economic distress and economic worries. And which kind of brings me back to where I started earlier, that it is an outgrowth of the failure of neoliberalism on a global scale. The failure of a global financial system that has, I mean, it's been most extreme, I think maybe we could say in the United States, uh, but has on a global scale, concentrated wealth, um, really impoverished entire countries, and created a planet on which uh, large portions large portions of the human population live in places that cannot sustain them, whether economically or in terms of natural resources. Um, that comes out of decades of neoliberalism on the heels of centuries of colonialism, and um, it is a Western responsibility. And I think one of the reasons that the global right has so much success talking about it it that this touches in a way that many people maybe are not even conscious of, on the quote unquote threat, because the threat is not that we'll be overrun with migrants or replaced by people from Africa and Latin America and Asia. The threat is that we'll have to actually face up to and make amends for, as I said earlier, the theft of resources and the impoverishment of so much of this planet, and that's going to cost us. That's going to cost us in the United States and in Europe and in Canada and Australia and other places that are relatively well often have their own people who are also uh, you know victims of that same neoliberal uh, 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 dichotomy, if you will, dichotomy between the rich and poor. So, eventually it all comes back to that. And again, it also is kind of, I think, wrapped up in why a socialist like Pedro Sanchez is seen as such a threat.
Yes, and he's very much lonely force in European politics these days, but a somewhat hopeful one, at least in his isolation, which is one of the other strange details of the story, I suppose. What I'd what I'd add to this is that kind of the lack of a European progressive response on this is that there has been a failure to kind of grapple with neoliberalism and what it really means about migration. The common kind of right wing story is that migration is this kind of unnecessary force in economics, and that it's just some sort of aberrant element in the global system that distorts the market. It creates the housing crisis, it creates the joblessness, it creates a downward push on wages and so on. But the story is very much inverted, and much of the left is aware of this and has the tools to respond to this, but there is a failure to do so, and that's really what we need. We need a much more assertive response to counter the narrative around Ceuta and all other events like it. And this is, although it's a major event, it's just one of many incidents which are being exploited by the European radical right, unfortunately. And so there has to be an effort to counter this. And I am cautiously hopeful that we're in such circumstances that some kind of response can be mounted, especially as there's increasing activism and kind of extra parliamentary efforts, at least in terms of organizing. And there isn't this kind of reflexive one party consensus of liberal politics or of progressive politics anymore. We are in a more a more volatile age of swinging back and forth. And certainly in the UK, we are. This is really talking beyond the circumstances of the Ceuta crisis or even Spanish politics.
Yeah, I think part of the reason that the left hasn't had a response to this is that the left and the progressive forces in the West just haven't thought about, this part of the world. They haven't thought about this or this part of the issue. I mean, with obviously some exceptions. There are people who study North Africa and pay a great deal of attention, but it's a small part of the left. It's a small part of academia. It's a small part of the progressive movement. Very small. And I think most people were just taken by surprise and just really didn't know how to respond. My sense is that in the week or so, week plus since this started, I guess close to 2 weeks now, it's gotten better, and people have gotten, more educated. So
And there is definitely hope in that. As more people, kind of educate themselves on this region and on this crisis, there is some hope that we can have that kind of response that is much needed, and it shouldn't just be a reactive case. A reactive. What I mean is that we need much more than just kind of responding to the right in a defensive posture, and we need to be much more assertive. And on that note, that's all for this week. Thanks for listening. This has been Globalists.